Good morning and welcome to the second day of EI's Global Electrification Forum. My name is Lawrence Jones, Senior Vice President for International Programs. We're delighted to have you joining us today. Those sharing with us in Washington, D.C., and those watching us from around the world, welcome. It's going to be an exciting day. We have quite a few conversations to have. We have our panel sessions, we have our virtual conversation with Information Minds. We also have some very interesting conversations we're calling Sparking the Charge. It's intended to really motivate your thinking and get you going as it relates to the energy transition, as well as it relates to some of the global challenges we're facing. So this morning, to kick us off, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first guest, Rana Foroohar, who is a global economic analyst at CNN, who will be joining us from Washington, D.C., or from New York to talk about a new book, Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Rana, welcome.
Are we ready to rock?
We're all ready to rock. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. This is the second day of the Global Electrification Forum, and obviously the theme for today, Homecoming. We're going to kick it off talking about your book, Homecoming, A Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. Well, listen, right at the beginning, why don't you first just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you kindly for that introduction. I'm delighted to be with you, and thank you so much for the consideration and time with my books. I have, for my sins, been a journalist for most of my 32 years working, and I had a brief foray at one point into venture capital, which I'll tell you about, but I basically started my career, I was a failed pre-med student, to be honest with you. I went into Columbia and did a double major in English and pre-med, and it's really good I had the English because the pre-med didn't work out. But it was great because it got me into journalism. And the thing about journalism that I found so addictive really is the ability to be curious about anything, to wake up in the morning and be able to call interesting people and ask questions. And I started out in business journalism. I had thought about going into political journalism, but it was quite a crowded field. And I'm really pleased, actually, that I was able to go into business journalism and economics, because in some ways, I think in the 30 plus years that I've been working, that's really been where the action is. I have worked at Forbes, I've worked at Newsweek, Time Magazine, and now at the Financial Times as a columnist. I've also authored 3 books. I have a TV contract as a contributor with CNN, and I've done radio, podcasts, speeches. So I've kind of been through the waterfront. I guess in terms of where I come from with my worldview, I would say I'm shaped very much by the place that I grew up, which was rural Indiana. My father was an immigrant from Turkey, and my mother's family are immigrants too, actually Swedish and English, and settled in the rural Midwest. And my father's a double engineer, industrial engineer, electric engineer, and he worked in the auto supply chain, sort of in the Detroit, ecosystem, running factories and eventually starting his own small manufacturing business. And I would say that I saw in a very real world way how industry worked, how manufacturing worked. And I also had a different perspective than many of my peers, who were in media on either coast, of how globalization itself had affected different communities, both in the US and abroad over the last several decades. So I try to bring that, mid-American experience to my work. I've been a foreign correspondent in many countries, so I try and really blend global and local. And that's very much, at the heart of the perspective that I have.
Well, look, let me first congratulate you on the book. So you talked about all of your global perspectives, and we'll get into that when we talk about the book in more detail. So in essence, you consider yourself a journalist or an economist?
I like to call myself a journalist, although, I'm deeply rooted in economics. I'm actually I'm teaching economics and business at Columbia University this spring. So I guess that makes me part of the club. But, I like to think of myself a little bit as an outsider to the profession, which I think is helpful because economics itself has come in for a bit of an existential crisis, I would say, in recent decades. Conventional Chicago school, efficient market theory, let's say, has worked in some ways in the last half century, but it's also failed to account for a lot of negative externalities. with the sort of technological job destruction, outsourcing, the hollowing out of certain parts of OECD nations. The last half century has seen a tremendous growth in global wealth, but it's also seen a tremendous growth in inequality. And that's something that the economics profession really didn't always account for. In fact, something I get into in this book is the fact that economists have always thought, as long as you create jobs at a net level globally, everything's fine. They didn't really think in terms of place. Well, maybe it's a little different to create jobs, just when you're thinking about the US, for example, in Austin versus in my hometown of Frankfurt, Indiana, or Brooklyn, New York, where I live, or at a global level, Brussels or Nigeria or Shenzhen. I think that economists are realizing that job creation and economic dynamics in different communities work in different ways. And that's something I'm really trying to dig into in this book.
So let's talk a little bit about diplomacy. So we started off with Jeff yesterday. We had several diplomats, ambassadors here. We had someone from the State Department talking about the importance of diplomacy in the context of the energy transition, as we're sort of discussing. I've had conversations about this previously. So from a business perspective, when you look at diplomacy, talk about the synergies between diplomacy and business, and how can these two worlds come together to have an impact on the energy transition?
That's such an interesting question. It's funny, last week, I was actually at Columbia University at the School of International and Public Affairs, and I was moderating a fireside chat with an EU diplomat. And diplomacy is in a tough spot at the moment, because I think in some ways diplomats, we're very much a part of the neoliberal world of, the world is flat, all boats are rising. We're all going to be on a kind of an even playing field. History has ended, as Francis Fukuyama would have told us. But that's not been the case. The world is not flat. The world is bumpy, and we are in more need of diplomacy, and particularly diplomacy in the political economy, I would say, than ever before. I think that one thing diplomats are struggling with is the fact that we do increasingly live in at least a one world, two systems paradigm. And what I mean by that is we have free market economies like the US, like Europe, some other OECD countries, some developing countries, and we have a state capitalist system. China would be the primary example there, but there are others that are coming into the Chinese orbit. And that's a very, very different paradigm than we've seen in the last half century. So I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I'm certainly not for trade wars or conflict, but I think that we have overestimated how far we can go with hyperglobalization. One of the things that I think has caused some of the political polarization and diplomatic problems that we've seen is the fact that in the neoliberal system, there was a certain assumption that capital, goods, and people could all travel equally and seamlessly across borders. But the truth of the matter is the capital investment always traveled faster than either goods and certainly than people. And so what that has led to is a situation in which you do have a sort of a global elite, a technocratic elite, and certainly an investment elite that are operating 35,000 feet above sometimes the interests of nation states. And that is causing problems because a lot of voters in nation states are saying, hey, wait a minute, are the economic policies being put forward by my country working for me? And so I think that's why, we're seeing a little bit of a pendulum shift away from the sort of world is flat paradigm that a lot of diplomats have worked with for the last half century, and more towards a regionalism and localism that will bring with it some conflict, but I believe will also bring with it a little bit of rebalancing, at least from an economic perspective. In the US, for example, we're seeing greater hubbing of production and consumption. All over the world, we're seeing a questioning of very far-flung complex supply chains. Do these make sense from an energy perspective? Or do they make sense from a carbon emissions perspective? Are there new technologies that could allow us to harness what is best of global and local at the same time? And so those are some of the economic questions that I see diplomats are going to have to start really incorporating into their worldview.
Yeah, so I was reading, but what I found fascinating was the amount of research you did in terms of putting together
anecdotes from, from different walks of life. I want to talk a little bit about this issue you talked about in the book regarding efficiency and resilience. And I bring it up because those are two words that are very, very pertinent for our industry. We spend a lot of time focusing on resilience and resilience for keeping the lights on and bring the system back up. But you talk about resilience and efficiency from a different angle in terms of an economic perspective, where you try to say, how do we create a world where resilience is the new metric, so to speak, as opposed to efficiency? Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. Folks that are in your world and dealing with these real world problems like keeping the lights on, resiliency is always top of mind. But for many business leaders that are sitting remotely in a corner office somewhere in a C-suite and making decisions about supply chains, they may be quite disconnected from what is actually happening in the real world, on the ground, in the factories where those lights need to be kept on. And in fact, many of the decisions are being taken, with the lessons one would learn at business school in a Finance 101 class, which is marshal your capital, try and move as much cost off the balance sheet as possible, treat labor like a cost rather than an asset. And what those truisms, let's say, of conventional business school teaching have led to is a lot of outsourcing to cheaper labor countries, a lot of sort of siloing and monopolization of supply chains. Let me give you an example. When the pandemic hit a few years ago, we saw a lot of disruption in supply chains. And one thing I think that many of us felt very acutely was the food supply chain. So suddenly the pandemic hits, nobody's going out to restaurants anymore. Those are all closed. We're all lining up at the grocery store, though, and suddenly shelves are empty. We can't find the tomato sauce or, the eggs or the basic products that you think, how can there be a shortage? And farmers are throwing away milk or meat or grain. And so there's this very odd supply and demand mismatch that conventional economics would tell us really shouldn't exist. How did this happen? Well, Business 101, Finance 101 has told the CEOs to basically go into very complex siloed supply chains. So the restaurant industry has one, the grocery store industry has one. There's about 3 or 4 companies that control each one, and they don't talk to one another. Now, that's an efficient system because it's fast, it's concentrated, but it's only efficient when there are no problems, right? When there's no pandemic, when there's not a tsunami that's interrupting a supply chain, in the auto industry, as happened in Japan a decade ago. And it also this sort of thinking comes with hidden risk on the balance sheet. So one of those risks clearly was being unable to get crucial PPE, being unable to get certain antibiotic inputs because they only came from China and they were not available at a certain period of time. So I think that business leaders everywhere are starting to rethink Finance 101 and maybe take a page out of the book of engineering, or the book of the Defense Department, where, folks really have that resiliency hat on all the time.
That's interesting. So this brings me to the trust of the book, where you talk about globalization. And you say a post-global world. Now, since maybe the last 3 years, there have been so many books written on globalization. Globalization is dead. Globalization is not coming back. And you talk about the post-global world, and then you try to sort of also explain it in that you're not saying that globalization is gone. You're saying it's going to be different. So talk about this new globalization from your perspective, with emphasis on regionalization and localization.
For sure. So let me step back a little bit first and say that I think if we go back in deep history, economic pendulums always swing, right? They swing back and forth. And when one system becomes too extreme, it swings back to the median. So you can go back in history and look at, say, the 18th century and say, okay, mercantilism worked until it didn't. And then we got more laissez-faire trading systems. And then you could look at, say, the run up to the 1920s and the 29 crash and the Great Depression. And then you could say, okay, now we get Keynesianism because we need a little more government nudging of the markets in a certain way to create demand. And then you could move into the 70s and say, all right, well, maybe markets became a little too sclerotic. Maybe we needed to unleash animal spirits. And so we got the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. Now, I think what we've seen is that hyper-globalization, in which capital has become so disconnected from labor and global has become too disconnected from local in terms of the needs of specific communities, we're once again seeing a pendulum shift back. And I would actually add one more thing, which is markets. Wall Street became a little too disconnected from Main Street as part of this. So you started seeing, a paradigm in which as long as share prices are going up and consumer prices are going down, everything's fine. But that doesn't account for the well-being of local communities as a whole, for job creation in different parts of the country and the world. So where are we now? I think we're moving towards, as you say, a new regionalism, a new localism in which governments everywhere are saying, you know what, it's not just about share prices and consumer prices. It's about a larger ecosystem of stakeholders. It's about making sure that individual communities aren't hollowed out in such a way that you start seeing deaths of despair, that you start seeing more political polarization because people are angry and hopeless. It's about creating launch pads. It's about creating resiliency and redundancy and making sure that wealth is not held in just a handful of places. So how is this operating? Well, there are a number of things pushing this, and I would point to two particular factors. We've heard a lot about contentious geopolitics and trade wars between the U.S. and China, and that's certainly part of the story. But well before the Biden administration, the Trump administration, you can go back to 2015 and look at China's Made in China 2025 proposal, which was quite interesting. It was the Chinese party coming out and saying, we think we have a new economic growth paradigm here. We are now a rich enough nation that we can both consume and produce. We don't want to just be the factory of the world. We want to consume more of what we're making at home and regionally. We want to control more local supply chains. And that made a lot of sense from an energy conservation, from an emissions conservation standpoint. You now see other areas, the US, Canada, Mexico sort of coming together in I would say, a new and improved sort of NAFTA arrangement. You see discussions transatlantically between the US and the EU about clean energy supply chains. You see in many places, US, Europe, and Asia, a rethinking of where and how should we be making basic goods like semiconductors, for example. So you think about the old system of globalization, very concentrated, very siloed. This led us to a place in which 92% of all high-end semiconductor chips were made in Taiwan. Now, that isn't necessarily good for really anybody. China, the US, Europe, that's a lot of concentration in one island. I mean, forget about if there's a hot war or any kind of geopolitical incident. Even if you had a tsunami in a place like that, you could suddenly have a global crisis because the lifeblood of the economy, semiconductor chips, would be wiped out. So you're seeing a move towards more regional resiliency, particularly in crucial goods. I think you're going to see this not only in semiconductors, but in clean energy, which we need as much of it as we can get. I have no problem with the Inflation Reduction Act because I think, great, if the US wants to subsidize clean energy, awesome. If Europe wants to subsidize it, great. If China wants to do it, awesome. We need more of that. Rare earth minerals, lithium batteries, certain kinds of antibiotics and chemical inputs. I think that we're going to see countries saying, maybe we need a little bit more supply and maybe we need redundancy of supply. So that's sort of what I mean at the high end. Also, let's say at the lower end, in terms of lower margin goods like textiles or furniture or shoes, lighting fixtures, there's been a rethinking for 10, 15 years of conventional supply chains. I think a lot of producers have said, we want to be faster to market. We don't want to spend as much on energy. We probably are going to see a period of energy inflation as we make a transition to clean energy. So that's something that a lot of businesses are thinking about. How can we keep production more closely hubbed with consumption? And what's really cool, and I'll just finish with one final thought on this point, There are so many new technologies that are allowing that to happen. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing, this is something I get into quite a lot in my book. Amazing. You can now 3D print entire supply chains for something like a jet engine or certain kinds of consumer electronics or medical devices. You can print them all at once in one place. That's something that was incredibly useful in the pandemic.
So Rana, we have the theme of this year, Jeff, is energizing 8 billion lives. And when we talk about globalization, let's talk about what it means for the perhaps 6 billion who may not necessarily have access to energy in the context of having it always available. And also, in the book, you get into this issue around system failure, where you talk about literally, big food. And I would put big food in the context of food, energy, water, the whole sort of a nexus there. Talk about how the world's population getting to 8 billion.
Yeah.
How do you see globalization working as the world gets even more populated in terms of regionalization, localization, and even just from a general sharing of the resources on the planet? How do you see these things working together?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Let me sort of take that in 2 parts. I'll first answer in a kind of a more philosophical way. One of the problems with efficient market theory, this kind of market knows best theory, is it worked in certain ways. It worked if you're talking about maybe consumer products or luxury goods. We know how to produce plenty of those. There's demand, there's supply. But certain kinds of public goods, as you said, clean water, clean energy, access to basic technologies in places that are not necessarily rich consumer markets yet, but might be that someday if they could get access to basic things that they need. The market hasn't always provided so well for those sorts of needs, and that has been a real negative externality. We have needed for decades now to make a shift to cleaner energy sources. The market hasn't really nudged us in that direction as fast as we need to go. And so you're seeing at a nation state level a rethinking of this. Different countries and different regions saying, we are going to have to nudge the market in this direction ourselves. Europe is doing this, Asia, US, all in different ways, but individual countries are too. We haven't talked yet about India. India is a fascinating market. West Africa, another. I would speak about Nigeria, but also other parts of West Africa, maybe as a single sort of regional market. You're seeing a lot of action of countries coming together and saying, we now have decentralized technologies. We have the ability to kind of leapfrog generationally technologies in ways that can help us to become more resilient. We're focusing more on providing for the needs of our internal markets. We're thinking about how to improve, local energy grids. We're thinking about how to use decentralized farming techniques to make sure that we don't end up with a global food crisis, as we have in the last few years, thanks to the pandemic. So I just think that this conversation about redundancy and resiliency is ultimately going to be a good thing. Now, you're also going to see, and this is where it could get a little tricky from a geopolitical standpoint, I think you're going to see some power jockeying, particularly between the US and China. I think that there's going to be, and you're already seeing this, a kind of a competition to bring countries into these separate economic orbits, let's say. And I think that jockeying is going to last for some time. In a way, though, this is good for smaller countries, particularly in emerging markets, because they've got a choice now between a couple of different systems. And I think that both China and the US are really going to have to cater more to the global South and say, here's what we're going to do for you, and here's how we're going to do it for you. And it's going to be interesting to see how the chips land there, and what the charm campaigns look like, I would say.
Rana, you've traveled around the world and you've had the fortune of interviewing a lot of business leaders. And one of the things that fascinated me when I read the book was the candidness in which you've taken the book in terms of engaging with them. What are you hearing from them in terms of
their view on this new globalization? Are they gonna, do you see them ready to adapt their business models or adapt their mindset to the reality that you will have 1, 2, 3 billion people across sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia who could be sort of the new magnet for the economic growth that they seem to want. So our business leaders looking at the potential in Africa, the potential in Asia, the potential in Africa, but they're still concentrated to their sort of a way they've always done business.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that they are quickly having to get much more geopolitically sophisticated. You know, if you look back in the last 20 years in particular, so China came into the WTO in 2001. And from that period onward, you saw a major flow of capital from Western multinationals, particularly in the US, into Chinese markets, into Asia in general, but mostly into China. A lot of that was the outsourcing of cheap labor, but also some of it was an entry into the Chinese market with a hope that that would become the #1 consumer market. And I think that there was a little bit linear thinking in that way. First of all, there was perhaps some naive assumptions about how quickly China would come into the Bretton Woods system. I mean, I have to say, I've been going to China now for 25 years. I remember landing the first or second time and just thinking, gosh, this is such an interesting, rich, different country. Why does anyone think that it's going to come seamlessly into the Bretton Woods system, the US and European-led system? It has its own traditions, conventions, economic rules of gravity. And this was brought home to me once. I remember interviewing a global CEO of a clean energy company in China, probably must be 15 years ago or so. And at the time, they were #1 in the wind energy space. And I asked the CEO, I said, so how are things going? What are your growth prospects like? And he's like, they're going pretty well. I think we're probably going to be in the #4 spot in the next 5 years or so. And I thought, gosh, well, wow, that's very precise. How do you know that? And 2, why is that good news that you're falling from #1 to #4? And he said, well, that's what Beijing has told us. And so I thought, wow, we are being perhaps a little naive and a little arrogant about the idea that China is just going to come along with US Anglo-American style capitalism. I think that scrim has now been pulled back. And so CEOs are thinking, wow, we have to get a lot more sophisticated about local economies and local rules of gravity. And as you point out, there is a global South, and there is, particularly in places like West Africa, parts of the Middle East, certain parts of the emerging market, this is the only place where there's population growth. And if you think about what is GDP growth, it's people plus productivity. And so CEOs are realizing the world is not flat. There is a very complex multinational system with a lot of different poles. We're in a very multipolar world now. And they have to get more sophisticated about taking this sort of think global, act local idea that we've heard floating around as a truism for a couple decades, and really putting some meat on those bones and figuring out how to cater to these markets.
So Rana, you also you looked at Council on Foreign Relations, and you mentioned the notion of what business leaders are thinking about. Let's just go back to the political aspect for a second, and maybe just talk about politicians in Western democracy, and how are they preparing their citizens for this new globalization in the context, in the sense that with millions of people emerging in Africa, Asia, and other, you will have a different world. Now, are they preparing their population for this new world where the dominance that perhaps once existed may not exist in the old frame? There has to be a new framing of what it means to be #1 and #2. So
absolutely. I love that phrase, a new framing. I mean, that is exactly what's needed. I'll step back and answer that question by pointing out that we have not done a great job, particularly in this country, of preparing citizenry for the changes ahead. And I'll give you an example. In fact, this is a story that really prompted me to write the third book. When I was thinking about, gosh, why has the global trading system become so fractious and complex? I went down to Washington to see a source of mine, Richard Trumka, who he's passed away now, but used to be the head of the AFL-CIO, which is the largest labor union. And I asked him, what were the conversations that you were having with policymakers in Washington in the mid-1990s when deals like NAFTA were being cut, when there was discussion about China coming into the WTO? What were you being told about how all this was going to work? And he said he remembers a policymaker coming to him in the mid-90s from the Clinton administration and saying, look, we know some of these changes are going to suppress wages in the US and in other rich countries. We know there's going to be a period of disruption, but don't worry. Eventually, all boats are going to rise. Things are going to level out, level up. And in the meantime, you're going to get a lot of cheap stuff, right? I mean, that was the bargain, that we were going to send jobs abroad and we were going to get cheaper flat screen televisions in the US. And Trumka said, well, okay, but how long is that wage parity, that leveling out, going to take? And the policymaker said 3 to 5 generations. And I remember hearing that story and looking and checking in my notebook, was that right? Did I get that time period? Because if you think about it, there's a certain arrogance. This goes back to your first question about the economics profession. There's a certain arrogance to think that, A, you can model perfectly what's going to happen globally over 5 generations. And that secondly, there aren't going to be political and social secondary effects of those changes that are then going to cause their own problems. And to me, that's what happened in the US. We did not have a national conversation about, look, there is a rising middle class globally. A lot more countries want to come into the global trading system. There's going to be trade-offs. We need to make sure that we really put a floor and more protection and compensation and education for dislocated workers in the West. We also need to accept that other countries will come in with their ideas about how the global system would run. We never had that conversation, but I think we are having that conversation now. And that's something I've been very pleased to see actually within the Biden administration, a sense that, okay, yes, we need to do better by American labor, but we also need to do right by allies. And how do you, that's the conversation, that's the very rich, challenging conversation that we're having right now. How do you balance the interests of national voters and workers with the interests of allies and other nation states abroad?
So the book has 16 chapters, very well researched. I want to just quickly talk about a few and just get your thoughts on them. One of them is, you call it exorbitant privilege, exorbitant burden. Talk about that. I thought that was very fascinating.
Oh, thank you for that. So I'm quoting a former French president who said that, being the reserve currency of the world, the dollar in this case, is both an exorbitant privilege and an exorbitant burden. And let's think about that. Why is that? So the dollar is the global reserve currency. That's been pretty much the case in the post-war era. That means that the US has the ability to run very high debt and deficit levels if it wants to, because, this is the dollar and everybody wants the dollar, and there's always going to be an inflow into dollar assets. So that allows countries a lot of leeway in terms of what they do with their budgets, what they spend on. We haven't had to have in this country those difficult guns and butter debates, to use the Vietnam War expression. Are you going to spend on defense? Are you going to spend on social programs? Other countries kind of, get pushed to make these choices. The US is not forced to make them in the same way. But there are also burdens to being the reserve currency. So what would be some of those burdens? Well, the dollar has been very strong relative to other currencies for a long period of time. And that means that American manufacturers have a burden when they're selling abroad because they're selling products in an expensive currency. So what does that mean? That basically sorts for a kind of financialization of the US economy. We get a lot of money coming into the system from abroad. We get a lot of folks wanting to buy US assets, T-bills, real estate, stocks and bonds, whatever it is. That pushes the financial economy up and kind of makes it preeminent. It creates a lot of asset price growth. But it also tends to create financial fragility. It creates excesses. It creates bubbles. And I think that after, 40 years of pretty easy money, low interest rates, as we begin to see a paradigm change now where interest rates are rising, There does seem to be a little bit more of a policy in this administration to say, you know what, we're not going to prioritize a strong dollar. We're going to prioritize more of a balance of manufacturing and industry and production and consumption. We're not going to just assume that everybody in this country can be a software developer or a banker. You know, we're going to think about a broader range of jobs. That is good in a lot of ways, but it also means that we're probably going to see some bubbles bursting. You know, we've already seen with the fall of Silicon Valley Bank, for example, and some of the ripple effects of that. Or globally, what we've seen in the UK with, which is another country that has a lot of financial excess. You've seen, a currency correction and some real problems in the economy in the UK. So we will see more of that. But again, I see the economy as a pendulum. It shifts. When it gets too extreme in one direction, it starts to swing back to the middle. And that's the process that we're in right now.
Two other quick conversations around two other chapters in the book, which I thought was very interesting. The caring economy. Talk about caring economy.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite chapters to research. I think that we are in for a major shift in the type of labor that we need. So let's think about what we've prioritized in the last half century or so. We've prioritized brain work. If you think about head, heart, hands, we've really prioritized head work, cognitive work. We've prioritized, moving up the food chain into higher value services, desk jobs. We haven't prioritized empathy. We haven't prioritized, work that's done with the hands. If you think about now, the technological disruption we're going through, AI is going to disrupt a tremendous number of white collar jobs. So everything we've seen in the manufacturing space, in the 80s and 90s and the noughties, that may be coming to higher level services now as artificial intelligence and other technologies can do more brain work. So what's left? Well, a lot of jobs in the care economy. If you think about the fastest growing job categories, out of the top 10 in America, 6 of them are in the care economy: healthcare, education, childcare. And unfortunately, many of these jobs have not paid as well. They've not been as highly prioritized or as valued. We talk about essential workers, but we don't often treat folks in these essential professions with as much respect, perhaps, as they deserve. And so I think we're going to have to shift now, as a lot of the cognitive work at a higher level will be done by technology. And yet we have aging populations. We have a tremendous need to change our educational systems. We have a healthcare system that has tremendous potential, but also a lot of challenges. How are we going to come together and really train people for those care economy jobs, but also create a higher value with those jobs? How are we going to use technology to raise them, to raise productivity levels, to raise pay? That's something that this administration in the US has been very, very focused on. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing a new prioritization of union work. I think you're seeing a lot of business leaders talking about, gosh, what should the education system look like? And you're going to see business and education and policymakers working together to revamp the system. If you think about it, we haven't had a real reset of K through 12 or college education in America since the post-World War II period, and we are overdue for that. So the care economy is going to be where the action is.
So I think the care economy, and I agree with you, but it's going to evolve differently in different parts of the world, right? Because on the one hand,
Indeed,
economies that have huge population, where you still would need a lot of sort of a non-K economy work, so to speak, being done. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, Rana. I just want to focus on a few key points to end our conversation here. So in the book, towards the end, you talk about, how do we think global and act local? And we're at the Global Electrification Forum, where energy systems, we spend our time thinking about how to design future energy systems. How do you see the local and the global working together in the context of energy?
Well, I really think that clean energy, the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources, and that balance and how it's shifting over time is going to be the economic story of our time. And there's tremendous potential there, because if you go back in history and you look at when were the times where we saw a lot of global growth, but it was also shared growth, that tended to be when there was a major transformative technology and you had standards of that technology that were sort of underwritten by the state. And then private businesses came in and worked and rolled out that technology. Railroads would be a perfect example, at the turn of the century in both Europe and the US and many other countries. Wow, new technology. The public sector comes in and says, okay, we're going to have this kind of gauge. We're going to have this kind of system. They set some standards. In the US, you see land grants, and then boom, it's like there's a fire that's lit and private industry comes in and starts rolling out this new technology. And then for decades to follow, there are all kinds of innovations that come off the back of that. If you just think of railroads, I mean, it wasn't just the putting in of the railroads that created growth. It was the development of the West. It was the creation of cities like Los Angeles. It was the development of mail order catalogs because deliveries could be made in different ways. So you get tremendous amounts of shared growth and real job creation. The internet, which was essentially a government project that was then commercialized, was that. Clean energy is that technology for this era. In my fantasy world, I would love to see, a global price on carbon that would really set a floor and allow us to all together make this change more quickly. But what I see, and it's a step forward, is different regions in their own way. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, certain kinds of clean energy standards in Europe, some of the state-run initiatives around strategic areas like lithium batteries in China. I see all these things moving us in a direction where clean is going to be the future. And that's going to create a tremendous opportunity, I think, for the private sector.
So 2 quick questions to wrap up, Ron. This has been a fascinating conversation. Let's talk a little bit about how do we go from where we are to where we should be going. Because you lay out a framework of what new globalization might look like, what it should look like. But talk to the audience, both here with us in DC and global, Washington world, around the world. How do we move from here? And how do we move in a way that doesn't create more disruption? I know it's a little difficult to transition, but how do we do it in a way that will get us to this new globalized world as you view it without sort of a crashing the entire system?
Yeah, I think we keep talking about people. I'm really pleased in this conversation. Oftentimes we have economic conversations that are about numbers and statistics and metrics, and that's all fine, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, economics are about solving problems for people. And I think that something that was forgotten in the neoliberal system was that you can't model the human experience perfectly. We have to think about not just share prices and, very, very sort of linear metrics. We need to think about the well-being of communities. We need to make sure to reconnect capital and labor. We need to move from a shareholder value system to a stakeholder value system. And energy is really the heart of that. I often think the energy, food, water nexus, that's where all economic action is going to be in the future. And in the middle of that are humans, right? These are the basic necessities that we need to live, and we need to make sure that people are being served by economic policy.
Well, I'm going to wrap up by going where I should have started this conversation and ask me a very interesting question that I've been thinking about for the last couple of days. I was preparing for us to have this conversation. So as a journalist, you've worked for Time, Newsweek, on CNN. How many articles have you published?
Oh my God. I haven't run a Google search or a Nexus search on that. It's definitely thousands, but maybe tens of thousands.
You want to know? I did research for you.
How many? Do you know?
Probably about 10,000.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I was right.
Well, no, I don't know if they were published. That's what Google said. I don't know if exactly were published, but your name popped up in the articles about 10,000 times.
Okay, well, gosh, you told me something I didn't know.
But be that as it may, the reason I did the research, I was going to ask you, where do you get your, the imagination to have written so many articles? I'm always intrigued by journalists. How do you come up with these new ideas? I want to go after this story or that story. Where does this spark come from?
Oh gosh, what an interesting. From talking to people like you, from being out here and talking and listening. It is an amazing privilege to be a journalist. You don't necessarily get rich in this profession, but boy, you're never bored. every single conversation, every single interaction is an opportunity for observation. And it's been my great privilege to be able to work in this field.
Well, listen, since you just talked about that, the book is Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. And whenever I have the opportunity and privilege to interview people like you, I always end by asking them, when is the next book coming up? And what's going to be the title of the next book? Because I want to be the first person to interview you when you get the next book out. So,
Okay.
maybe you share by telling us the title, or at least the topic of your next book.
Well, this is very nascent. I mean, really nascent, in part because there's been such a great reception to this book that I've really, it came out in October. I've really been on this, kind of off talking to groups like you, like yours, to people like you for the last several months. But I'm starting to think a lot about intellectual property and software, data, human intelligence. If you look at where 80% of corporate value now lives, it lives in those things. It lives in people and in data, and how that intellectual property is going to be valued, how the pie of wealth is going to be split up, how data is going to be shared across industries, and the data harvested from individual consumers, how that is going to be perhaps repaid to them in some ways. I'm thinking about that. I don't have a title yet, though.
Well, I can tell you, if you get a book done by next April, you're welcome back to the Global Electrification Forum to have another conversation about your new book.
Oh,
So, congratulations and thank you for joining us.